The main thing we learn from a serious attempt to practice the Christian virtues is that we fail. Welcome to Philosophers, explained by me, Stephen Hicks. This series covers major philosophers and core texts in intellectual history, especially the great classics. From each, I've selected an excerpt, 30-40 minutes, no more than an hour, and our purpose is to do a close reading with the accompanying text. In this episode, we are turning to C.S. Lewis and his 1943 work, Mere Christianity. In this excerpt that we're going to be discussing, Lewis focuses on Christian morality and Christian virtues, trying to reintroduce them into a modern world that he thinks has gone seriously astray. Let's go to the text. Before we turn to Book 3 and Lewis's discussion of the core Christian virtues, a few remarks from his preface in which he explains his purpose in writing the book and a couple of contextual matters for describing morality in particular. So one thing he says right at the beginning is who his intended audience is, and he intends this not to be an internal to Christianity discussion. Rather, he is focusing on people who are not yet Christian, are considering being Christian, or are having some doubts about whether they should remain Christians or not. So, as he puts it here, you will not learn from me whether you ought to become an Anglican, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, or a Roman Catholic. So in this book, I'm not trying to convert anyone to my own position. And then he goes on to say, ever since I became a Christian, I have thought the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. Now, of course, there's a danger there that he recognizes that his own particular version of Christianity is the one that will dominate, and so what he says is he checked against that. So what he did was send his manuscript to a bunch of other Christians, high-level Christians, but from a variety of denominations, and got their feedback on whether he was presenting kind of core Christianity or Christianity that was peculiar to him. So I tried to guard against this by sending the original script to 4 clergymen, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, and asking for their criticism. And we have a range of Christians from kind of high church Roman Catholicism to low church Methodism and Anglicanism and Presbyterianism, somewhere in the middle there. And basically he said, he got some minor criticisms here and there, but all of them said, you're on track, CS, and this is a good manuscript. This is core Christianity. And he also says that since he delivered the original talks as some radio talks, which are now worked up into this book, he received a number of responses, and basically that's he got a thumbs up with respect to that. So far as I can judge from reviews and from the numerous letters written to me, the book did at least succeed in presenting an agreed or common or central or mere Christianity. And that explains his choice of title for the work as a whole. It's not mere in any sort of lowering or dismissive sense, but rather a more traditional understanding of mere as common, central, or agreed upon central doctrine. So what he is then saying is he doesn't see that there's anything in this book that should be offensive or particularly disagreeable to Christians. This is standard doctrine, and what he is doing is trying to make it more intelligible, understandable, and perhaps more palatable to a modern world that is no longer predominantly Christian. So, Christian morality, and what I want to do is first have a look at the table of contents here, just to get a sense for the range of Christian virtues that Lewis discusses. So he has an introductory chapter on the nature of morality, a somewhat a taxonomical scheme there. Some of the cardinal virtues, some of them inheritances from traditional Greek morality that would have been recognizable to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and some of the other Greek and Roman schools. But then in chapter 3 especially, he transitions to this specifically Christian virtues and the specifically Christian take on some of those virtues. So he talks about Christian marriage, sexual morality, forgiveness, the great sin, which is going to be pride, its contrast, humility, charity, hope, and then interestingly noting that the final two chapters, and there's two chapters devoted to one virtue, faith, and in a way that is the more complicated virtue to explain, but it's also on Lewis's reading of Christianity, the capstone virtue, or even the fundamental virtue that needs to be striven for before any other sort of virtue can be at least partially realized. Okay, in now turning to Book 3, where these 12 chapters are going to discuss each of the virtues in some detail. A few prefatory remarks about the metaphysics of virtue. Really, every moral code or every ethical system relies on a metaphysics, some understanding of what human nature is and what the nature of reality more broadly is. If we want to say something is good, bad, right, wrong, well, good for whom and for what? What are we trying to accomplish? What are the rules of the universe, so to speak, within which we are operating? One point he insists upon and highlights significantly early on in this chapter is the Christian answer to the question, who owns you, or to whom does your life belong? Is my life mine to live as I judge, or is that not the case? And so he raises the question this way: does it not make a great difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own mind and body, or only a tenant responsible to the real landlord? If someone else made me for his own purposes, then I shall have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belonged to myself. So what we find is Lewis disagreeing with what has come to be a strong position in the modern world, that people should be self-owners, that my life is mine, perhaps as moral right and perhaps also as a political right. I have a right to life. I have a right to my liberty. I should be pursuing happiness by my own lights. And what Lewis is indicating is that the Christian position is not that. You come into the world made by someone else for some purposes by one's maker. And so that means that you do not belong to yourself. You do not have perfect freedom. Instead, you come in with some purposes prepackaged, some duties that are assigned to you. You are, to use the metaphorical language here, a tenant of your mind and body. The real landlord or the real owner is going to be, of course, God. Second foundational point is when we're thinking about what the good life is or what the moral life is, it makes a huge difference whether we think of ourselves as mortal beings or immortal beings. What is, so to speak, the time span that we need to evaluate the good in terms of? Christianity asserts that every human being is going to live forever. So we are immortal beings, and our time here on earth in the material/physical world is a temporary station, or perhaps even only a blink of an eye, considering the time span of immortality. And he makes an interesting comparison from individuals to societies or to civilizations in terms of how we think about these value framings. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or a nation or civilization, which may last for 1,000 years, is more important than an individual. But if Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, for he is everlasting, and the life of a state or a civilization compared with this is only a moment. So partly this is raising a value issue. We need to be thinking in terms of immortal values rather than values that are only going to last for 70 years or so. Those will be downgraded to lower values or perhaps not even values at all. But also it's going to partly be a social and a political point about where one's ultimate loyalty should lie. It cannot be with a state or a civilization, and if one's loyalty is to a state or a civilization are in conflict with one's religious loyalties or Christian loyalties, then it's clear that the state values and obligations to one's civilization would have to be subordinated. All right, jumping ahead to chapter 3, where he starts to focus on Christian morality. Chapter 2 I'm skipping over because there we have a discussion of Greco-Roman virtues, some of which are incorporated with some modifications into the Christian framework, but we'll save discussion of those for a Greek and Roman philosophy discussion. There's nothing uniquely Christian about that inheritance or borrowing from the Greco-Roman. But it's in chapter 3 where we start to get the distinctively Christian virtues presented by Lewis. Now, first point he makes is that Christianity is schematic, it's general, or it is generic, and there's more detailing work that needs to be done by area experts. And so what we should not do is take Christian doctrine too specifically and say, therefore, this is the right position in politics or economics or foreign policy or whatever. Instead, what we just have is some general principles that all Christian lay people and Christian clergy should be signing on to, but then their specific application can't necessarily easily be read off. That's going to require some area expertise. So Christianity has not and does not profess to have a detailed political program for applying, in this case, do as you would be done by. Nonetheless, he goes on to say, the New Testament, without going into details, does give us a pretty clear hint of what a fully Christian society would look like. And then he goes on to give us some specifics here. If a man does not work, he ought not to eat. So we have an obligation to work, and that obligation to work is tied to one's claims on whatever has been produced as a consumer. Further, Christianity does not believe in luxuries. There will be no manufacture of silly luxuries and then of sillier advertisements to persuade us to buy them. So what is produced should be necessities and nothing beyond the necessities. And so we're starting to criticize some elements of modern economies that are very productive with respect to all sorts of things that Lewis, as a Christian, does not think are necessary. And the entire advertising industry is immediately under suspicion as well. And then he goes on to use some more contemporary modernistic language. So here he says, to that extent, a Christian society would be what we now call leftist. A little bit later, he's going to use the language of socialism or socialistic. And so what he is then saying is Christianity should see itself on the economic side of things as more in line with the ethos underlying or the ethos of leftism or socialism. On the other hand, though, it is always insisting on obedience. Obedience from all of us to properly appointed magistrates, from children to parents, and I'm afraid this is going to be very unpopular, from wives to husbands. So this is not a strictly economic point. This is a more social and / political point, that in Christianity we find this emphasis on obedience in a hierarchical direction. So what we then find is what might seem a combination that is in tension with each other, a kind of egalitarian leftism critical of modern capitalism or free markets with all of its advertising and silly luxuries and so on, and a kind of a notion that everybody equally is going to be working, and all of that is in keeping with socialism. But then at the same time, this emphasis on obedience in a hierarchical direction, which sounds much more traditional and more authoritarian. So how do we combine this leftism or this socialism with this obedience and authoritarianism? Nonetheless, Lewis says that's what Christianity should be in general. So if there were such a society in existence, and we were to check it out, a Christian society, and we were looking at it, we should feel that its economic life was very socialistic. and in that sense advanced, but that its family life and its code of manners were rather old-fashioned, perhaps even ceremonious and aristocratic. Okay, so some combination of hierarchical obedience and kind of leftist socialist, everybody works and no manufacturing of kind of capitalistic luxuries and advertising and so on. Another element has to do with the whole fundamental institution of capitalism, which is to say investing capitalism and expect a kind of profitable return, particularly the kind of capitalism that involves lending and expecting to receive interest on one's lending. There's a bit of advice given to us by the ancient heathen Greeks and by the Jews in the Old Testament, and by the great Christian teachers of the Middle Ages, which the modern economic system has completely disobeyed. All these people told us not to lend money at interest, and our lending money at interest, what we call investment, is the whole basis for our whole system. So this then is an indication that if we take Christianity seriously, at least as the tradition has come down, the entire modern economic system is wrong, or at least morally suspect. Now, he does then go on to say there are some interpretive issues about what we mean by interest and usury and so on. And he says, I'm not an economist, this is a question that I cannot decide on, but he does insist that whether one is an expert or not, the three great civilizations of traditional times have agreed in condemning the very thing on which we have based our entire life. Okay, now we do work. Why do we work? And one reason we might then say that we work is, well, because we want to make money, because we want to live, we want to satisfy our self-interest and pursue our happiness and so on. And Lewis then goes on to argue that is not what the New Testament says is the reason that we should work. It's not a self-interested reason that we work for, but rather for a more other-focused kind of reason. In the passage where the New Testament says that everyone must work, it gives as a reason, quote, in order that he may have something to give to those in need. Charity is the primary reason why we work. It's an other-focused religion, and we work in order to be service to others, and specifically those others who are in need. And then he goes on to say there, of course, is some detail, arguments rather over the details about how much we are supposed to give. But he goes on to say, in keeping with this point, that we should not be consuming luxuries and having extras in our lives, that the amount that we give should hurt. It should be a sacrifice in some sense. I do not believe that one can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. In other words, if our expenditure on comforts, luxuries, amusements, etc., is up to the standard common among those with the same income as our own, we are probably giving away too little. If our charities do not at all pinch or hamper us, I should say they are too small. So, charity as a core virtue, we ought to work, and we ought to work in order to be charitable and sacrificial charitable as much as we possibly can. All right, jumping next to the chapter on sexual morality and the core virtue of chastity. Now, what do we mean by chastity? He goes on to say, chastity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. But as he then goes on to say, there's no getting away from it. The old Christian rule is, quote, either marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner or else total abstinence. All right, that's strong, that is stark, and Lewis recognizes it and makes no bones about it. Now, this is so difficult and so contrary to our instincts that obviously either Christianity is wrong or our sexual instinct, as it now is or has gone wrong. One or the other. Hard choice, hard dilemma. Of course, being a Christian, I think it is the instinct which has gone wrong. So he's going to maintain the position that one should be have sex only in the context of marriage, otherwise total abstinence, and then once married, complete faithfulness to your party. Now, he draws an interesting analogy over the course of the next couple of paragraphs to another instinct that we have. We have the desire for food as an instinct, and we like to indulge our desire for food, to eat a lot and to eat tasty foods, right, and so forth. But we can all recognize, Lewis suggests, when the food instinct goes wrong, right? If we become gluttonous and our food appetite controls us rather than our eating the amount that we need in order for our health. And he gives an interesting analogy here, right? Suppose we consider the sexual morality first. Obviously it's easy to get a large audience together for a strip tease act, that is, to watch a girl undress on the stage. So there are lots of strip tease places all over the place. Now, suppose you came to a country where you could fill a theater by simply bringing a covered plate onto the stage and then slowly lifting the cover so as to let everyone see just before the lights went out that it contained a mutton chop or a bit of bacon. Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with the appetite for food? So that would be weird, right, to watch a kind of striptease act for food. Something's gone wrong with our food instinct. So by analogy, people who are watching girls undress on the stage, something has gone wrong with the sex instinct. And that is where we are in modern times. Now, I do not say that you and I are individually responsible for the present situation. So we all have our sex instinct, and sometimes it gets out of control. We might say maybe we ourselves have gone to these striptease shows. Partly we as individuals are responsible, but Lewis here wants to indicate that we are born into a modern society that has fostered this, that has enabled this, and so much of the blame lies with society, and that our ancestors have passed down certain habits that we have inherited. I do not say that you and I are individually responsible for the present situation. Our ancestors have handed over to us organisms which are warped in this respect. So we have a warped biological package, and we have a warped social context. We grow up surrounded by propaganda in favor of unchastity. So God knows our situation. He will not judge us as if we have no difficulties to overcome. What matters is the sincerity and perseverance of our will to overcome. So we need to fight against our warped instincts. We need to fight against the social propaganda about sexuality that surrounds us. Fight the good fight. Now, are we going to be able to do so? No, absolutely not. Right? Lewis goes on to say, we may indeed be sure that perfect chastity, like perfect charity, will not be attained by any merely human effort. You must ask for God's help. And of course, we're going to ask for God's help, and then we're going to try again. We're going to fail. To be chaste, never mind. After each failure, ask forgiveness. Pick yourself up and try again. Very often what God helps us towards is not the virtue itself, but just this power of trying again. And he's going to argue that this trying and failing and failing and failing is an important life lesson that's going to set us up for the more important later Christian virtue, and especially the virtue of faith. So let's hold this repeated failure in mind for that later discussion. For however important chastity may be, this process trains us in habits of the soul which are more important still. It cures our illusions about ourselves and teaches us to depend on God. We learn on the one hand that we cannot trust ourselves even in our best moments, and on the other that we need not despair even in our worst, for our failures are forgiven. All right, closely related to this issue of chastity, of course, is marriage, and the only context within which sexual relations can and should occur for for Christianity. What is a marriage? And interestingly, Lewis wants to argue that marriage should not be seen as two individuals who come together, reach a certain sort of agreement, make commitments to each other, and that what we have is a social and legal relationship of two individuals. That's not the right way to look at it. Instead, marriage is metaphysically a God-created union, and what might look like two separate individuals still able to go about their business are in fact one single unity, a conjoined entity. But you have to look at it from a metaphysical perspective, not a physical perspective. The Christian idea of marriage is based on Christ's words that a man and wife are to be regarded as a single organism, right? One flesh. Now, as the Christians believe that when he said this, he was not expressing a sentiment, but stating a fact. So it's not a metaphor or it's not a feeling, it is a fact. As one says that a lock and its key are one mechanism, or that a bow and a violin are one musical instrument. The inventor of the human machine was telling us that two halves, the male and the female, were combined together in pairs, not simply on the sexual level, but totally combined. All right, and so if we take only a physicalistic perspective and say, oh, those are two individuals, that is a superficial perspective. In fact, once they are married, God has enjoined them. Metaphysically, they are one being. Now, marriage is for life, no divorce. As a consequence, Christianity teaches that marriage is for life. God has joined you, and what God has done, only God can undo. The modern idea of a divorce, that two people have made a commitment to each other, and perhaps they are mutually agreeable that the marriage isn't working out, so that they're mutually going to decide and jointly decide to break up the marriage. It is not theirs to perform the divorce because they are not the ones who created the marriage in the first place. So Christians then would all regard divorce as something like cutting up a living body, as a kind of surgical operation. Some of them think that the operation is so violent that it cannot be done at all. Others admit it as a desperate remedy in extreme cases. So there is some room for divorce in some versions of Christianity, but all of them are in contrast to the modern individualistic contract idea of divorce. What they all disagree with is the modern view that it is a simple readjustment of partners to be made whenever people feel they are no longer in love with another, or when either of them falls in love with someone else. So, is it an individual doing or is it a God doing? Is the purpose of marriage to experience love and to keep the love alive? And so if the love is no longer there, the marriage can properly be ended. Lewis wants to argue no on both counts. Instead of seeing marriage as being about love primarily, he wants to argue that it should be about justice and about keeping one's promises. And so that's in the next paragraph here. Justice includes the keeping of promises. And so if we then say, skipping down to the next paragraph, the idea of being in love as the only reason for remaining married, then if that's the case, then that leaves no room for marriage as a contract or a promise at all. So in the modern view, we say, two individuals, they fall in love, they make a commitment to each other, but if they fall out of love, then in principle they can undo their commitments to each other and be divorced and go their separate ways. So what Lewis is arguing is that the Christian position is that God makes the marriage and only God can undo the marriage, and that's going to be an extraordinarily rare occasion in Christianity. And the marriage is not primarily about love, but rather the marriage is about having made a promise. Now, it is true that the marriage partners make a promise to each other, but Lewis wants to argue the Christian position is more important than that, is that each partner has made a promise to God, and you don't break your promises to God. Right? So, if you've made this promise and you think, well, in the back of my mind, I can just get out of this promise, there's no way of doing so. You can't deceive God. God knows that you made a promise to him. And so if you're trying to get out of your promise, that is just completely wrong. All right. Another point that he thinks is then a characteristic of Christian marriage that he recognizes in the modern world is going to be extraordinarily unpopular. Christian wives promise to obey their husbands. In Christian marriage, the man is said to be the head of the family. And so then he says there's two obvious questions. Well, why do we need to have a head of a family at all? Why not just equal? And then if there's not equal and we are going to have a head, why should the head be the man? And so he goes on to give Christian arguments for both of those. The first one is to think about marriage as a kind of politics. And obviously both partners will agree a lot, but they'll have some disagreements. And the question is going to happen when there is a disagreement between the husband and wife. There still needs to be a decision, right? The family needs to act in a certain way. And if we have strict equality and one partner is voting this way and the other partner is voting the opposite way, nothing can be done. So that potential for voting gridlock needs to be broken, and the only way to break it is by saying that one person's say counts for more than the other said. So if marriage is permanent, one or the other party must, in the last resort, have the power of deciding the family policy. So then the second question, well, why the man? Why not the woman? Right? Or why not different? Sometimes it's the man in this relationship and sometimes it's the woman in this other relationship. And Lewis wants to argue that it should be the man. And partly he points to how people react to families in which metaphorically the woman clearly is the one wearing the pants. She's in charge. She says what goes, and the husband goes along with whatever the wife says. He points out there must be something unnatural about the rule of wives over husbands, because the wives themselves are half ashamed of it, and they despise the husbands whom they rule. But then, more interestingly, he makes an analogy to foreign policy. And what he wants to say is that there are differences between men and women in terms of their psychologies and their value priorities. And when we consider the family in relationship to the rest of society, that difference in value framework and psychology becomes important. The relations of the family to the outer world, what might be called its foreign policy, must depend in the last resort upon the man, because he always ought to be, and usually is, much more just to the outsiders. And then this is where the point about value hierarchies and sexual psychology comes into place. A woman is primarily fighting for her own children and husband against the rest of the world. Now, obviously, the husband loves his family, he loves his wife, he loves his children, but he's arguing here that the woman is fiercer in defense of her family. The man is loves his family, but he's also a little less fierce, and so more likely then to understand what a fair or a just claim with respect to his family and the rest of the world is going to be. So he's going to be a better mediator when there are conflicts, a better diplomat when there are such conflicts, and better able to work out arrangements that are going to minimize the conflict. And so the function of the husband is to see that this natural preference of hers is not given its head. So the man should be the one in charge, and that is the Christian position. All right, moving on to the virtue of forgiveness. And then Lewis here suggests, now that he thinks about it, maybe chastity is not the most unpopular. Maybe it's this one here, forgiveness. I said in a previous chapter that chastity was the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. I'm not sure I was right. The Christian rule, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. That one might be even more unpopular. In Christian morals, thy neighbor includes thy enemy. And so we come up against this terrible duty of forgiving our enemies. And already he imagines the reactions. We start to imagine our worst enemies, and it seems impossible that we could ever forgive those. And then we think on a world scale of all of the horrible, horrible things some human beings have done to each other. Lewis is writing this in the midst of World War II and preparing it for book publication shortly after World War II. So everyone is thinking about the war and the Holocaust rather. And half of you are already want me to ask, quote, I wonder how you'd feel about forgiving the Gestapo if you were a Pole or a Jew. And Lewis recognized that's a very hard problem. Yeah, so do I. I wonder very much. And so he says, well, look, I'm a Christian, so all I can do is precious little. I am telling you what Christianity is. I did not invent it. And right there, right in the middle of it, I find, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. So it is a Christian obligation, a Christian duty, no bones about it. Now, he then goes on to try to give some helpful advice about how possibly we can do it. And what he says is basically try to start small. Let's not go immediately to the Gestapo and the Nazis and the Holocaust and so on. Start with people you already care about, but who will offend you in various small ways. So one might start with forgiving one's husband or wife, or parents, or children, or the nearest NCO for something they have done or said in the last week. All right, and that's going to be a challenge, but do that, practice that, and then start to work on more challenging ones. But he does also give another analogy here. He says, look, think about yourself, and we all commit sins, we do various wrong things, but we don't find it particularly hard to forgive ourselves. And in fact, we often let ourselves off the hook for all sorts of things that we know are transgressions that we have committed. And how do we do that? Perhaps we can learn something from that. How exactly do I love myself? Well, my self-love makes me think myself nice, but thinking myself nice is not why I love myself. And so then he says when he is honest, when he introspects upon his inner nature, he puts on this front of being a nice guy, but in my most clear-sighted moments, not only do I not think myself a nice man, I know that I am a very nasty one. So I'm a nasty guy. I know this honestly, but nonetheless, I still am able to love myself, and I'm still able to forgive myself. So what we then have is, apparently I'm allowed to loathe and hate some of the things my enemies do. So just as I can loathe some of the things that I do, nonetheless forgive myself, I can, by analogy, use that as leverage for learning how to loathe some of the things my enemies have done, nonetheless forgive them. I admit this means loving people who have nothing lovable about them, but then has oneself anything lovable about it. You love it simply because it is yourself, and God intends us to love all selves in the same way. All right, forgiveness. Moving on to chapter 8 and the great sin. Right, and this is some very strong language here. The vice I am talking of is pride or self-conceit. And the virtue opposite to it in Christian morals is called humility. So pride as the great vice, humility as the great virtue. He wants to then argue that here we have come to the center or the most important thing with respect to Christian virtues. Some of the other virtues that we've been talking about and vices focusing on things that are more physical, sex, food, the desire for wealth, and so on. Those are vices, but they are not as viceful as the ones infecting our soul or our spirit. And of those, he's going to argue that pride is the worst. According to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil, is pride. And he goes on to list a whole bunch of them and say they are just flea bite vices by comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Okay, strong language. Lewis recognizes this. Does this seem to you exaggerating? He wants to say, he doesn't think so, rather. Now, what is pride, though? You think well about yourself, but Lewis wants to define it more narrowly. Pride is essentially competitive. It's not thinking well about yourself. It's thinking well about yourself in relationship to other people. It's not thinking that you are good. It is thinking that you are better than other people. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. So this soul comparison, I am better than other people in various respects. We all do this, he wants to say, all of the time, and we get this pleasure out of it. That is the problem. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once the element of competition has gone, pride has gone. So competitiveness is then a sin. And this, of course, is going to involve economic competitiveness and another implicit critique here, at least, of kind of modern free market capitalism that makes competitiveness at the core. But what he is emphasizing here is not only that, it is any sort of competitiveness of you with respect to other people and wanting to think that you are better than others. So if you take the competition away, you're not going to be thinking of yourself as any better than anyone else. Everybody will then more or less be at the same evaluative worth. I am no better, I am no worse than anybody else in the world. That's going to be closer to the proper state. Now, strong claim again, the Christians are right. It is pride which has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. And that is a very strong claim. So if you think of all of the bad things that happen in the world, wars, other kinds of conflicts, sexual fights, jealousies, right, and so forth, stealing, theft, kidnapping, rape, and so on, underlying that is pride. And so how that happens, an interesting question to follow up on. Pride always means enmity. It is enmity, and not only enmity between man and man, but enmity to God. And so here we find the corrective. Right? So I want to think that I am better than other people around me, and so I can stand tall and strut around. And so Lewis is then going to argue this is why so many proud people end up becoming unbelievers. They don't want to think of themselves in relationship to God, because they know if they start comparing themselves to God, their pride is going to be humbled. In God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know that God as that, and therefore know yourself nothing in comparison. You are nothing in comparison to God. You do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. You must be humiliated and experience humility at a fundamental level. A proud man is always looking down on things and people, and of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. Luckily, though, we have a test. When we find that our religious life is making us feel that we are good, suppose we're trying to be good Christians and we're doing a pretty good job of it this week, and so we start to feel proud of this, and I start to see my neighbors are still sinning and so on, and I am better than they are. I think we may be sure that we are being acted on not by God, but by the devil. And then the test. The real test of being in the presence of God is that you either forget about yourself altogether, or you see yourself as a small, dirty object. And that is humility. To really feel humble, to feel humiliated, is that honest self-reflection. And then when you do that from this Christian perspective, I just say, I'm just a small, dirty object. You can't possibly be proud in that context. But of course, that's pretty nasty. But he then says, it is better to forget about yourself altogether. All right, moving on to the virtue of hope, a future-oriented, and just one quick point here, that it is tied to not this life, but rather the afterlife. Hope means a continual looking forward to the eternal world. Now, earlier we noted that there are not one but two chapters on faith, and faith is going to be a capstone virtue in Christianity, in the sense that we can't get to faith unless we understand all of the earlier virtues that we have discussed, what they require of us, and our efforts in order to try to live up to those virtues. But it's also complicated because there are many different understandings of faith in theological and philosophical history, and so dealing with that complexity leads Lewis to devote two chapters to faith, complex and most important. So, roughly speaking, the word faith seems to be used by Christians in two senses, or on two levels. I'm going to take them in turn. In the first sense, it means simply belief, accepting or regarding as true the doctrines of Christianity. This is fairly simple. So Christianity is, say, this list of propositions or this list of beliefs, and that is what I accept, that is what I commit to. Christianity is my faith, and by that I mean that set of beliefs. Now, interestingly, he then goes on to contrast that one of the big debates over the nature of faith and its relationship to reason. And some versions of faith will say faith means believing something even if you don't have any evidence for it, or even if it violates evidence and seems irrational and not to have anything that can be said in reason for it. And Lewis wants to say that's not going to be his understanding of what the Christian position is. I am not asking anyone to accept Christianity if his best reasoning tells him that the weight of evidence is against it. That's not the point in which faith comes in. So instead, what he's going to say is faith means, however you get there, that you have made a commitment to Christian doctrine. You are a Christian. You believe in Christianity. But the way human psychology works is that that level of commitment wavers sometimes. So there will come a moment when there is bad news, or he is in trouble, or is living among a lot of other people who do not believe it. And all at once his emotions will rise up and carry out a sort of blitz on his belief. So faith, in the sense in which I am here using the word, is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. Consequently, one must train the habit of faith. So faith is a matter of making your belief habitual and re-upping your faith commitment in those moments when one has doubts. And that is the first sense of faith. Now I must turn to faith in the second or higher sense. And this is the more important understanding of faith, what it requires, what it means, and what it consists of in the uniquely Christian fashion. This is the most difficult thing I have tackled yet. I want to go back to it, approach it rather, by going back to the subject of humility. You may remember that I said the first step towards humility was to realize that one is proud. I want to add now that the next step is to make some serious attempt to practice the Christian virtues. A week is not enough. Things often go swimmingly for the first week. Try 6 weeks. By that time, having, as far as one can see, fallen back completely or fallen even lower than the point one began from, one will have discovered some truths about oneself. All right, so we have a point here. We all start off as proud. We think that we are strong. We're pretty good people. We have come to believe that Christianity is the right doctrine, and we have made our commitment to believing it, and so we are now faithful people. And so I am going to obey the Christian virtues. I'm not just going to have it as a set of beliefs in my mind. I am going to live according to Christianity. So I'm starting off in a pretty good position. So what is going to happen? Well, I'm going to fail. And when I fail, I am then going to puncture that sense of strength and self-worth that I had, and I'm going to go back to a point. So I'm going to be humbled by my attempt to practice the Christian virtues. Only those who try to resist temptation know how strong it is. We never find out the strength of the evil impulse inside us until we try to fight it. The main thing we learn from a serious attempt to practice the Christian virtues is that we fail. That's the main thing. We fail. We can't do it. If there was any idea that God had set us a sort of exam and that we might get good marks by deserving them, that has to be wiped out. That's an element of pride interjecting here. The idea that somehow I have the strength to practice the Christian virtues by myself, that I can become a deserving individual. All of those are patting myself on the back, morally speaking, thinking well of myself. Those are anti-humility. If there was any idea of a sort of bargain, any idea that we could perform our side of the contract and thus put God in our debt so that it was up to him in mere justice to perform his side, that has to be wiped out. So the idea that somehow, okay, I've got this list of virtues I'm supposed to practice, and I'm going to practice the virtues, and I'm going to do so successfully, and I'm going to build up, so to speak, my resume, and then I'm going to go to God and say, here, God, I've got the checklist here, here's my resume. You have to reward me because I have passed the test. That has to be exploded also. Everyone who has some vague belief in God until he becomes a Christian has the idea of an exam or of a bargain in mind. The first real result of real Christianity is to blow this idea into bits. Once you have tried, you've tried hard and you have failed and you have been humiliated, but then you tried again and you are humiliated even further. Then comes another discovery. Every faculty you have, your power of thinking or of moving your limbs from moment to moment is given you by God. If you devoted every moment of your whole life exclusively to his service, you could not give him anything that was not already, in a sense, his own. All right, so that is the preparatory remarks in the first chapter. We can now go on to talk of faith in the second and higher sense more systematically. So, recapitulating what we discussed in the previous chapter, Lewis says, the question of faith in this sense arises after a man has tried his level best to practice the Christian virtues and found that he fails, and seen that even if he could, he would be only giving back to God what was already God's own. In other words, he discovers his bankruptcy. We are morally bankrupt beings, and the deep realization, an honest realization of that in ourselves is fundamental. We are bankrupt beings. What does it mean to discover this? We cannot discover our failure to keep God's law except by trying our very hardest and then failing. Unless we really try, whatever we say, there will always be at the back of our mind the idea that next time I'm just going to try harder and I will be completely good. But we have to fail and fail and fail. All of this then leads up to the vital moment at which you turn to God and say, you must do this, I can't. I am completely humbled, I am completely powerless, I am completely bankrupt. I give up and I turn myself over to God. It is the change from our being confident about our own efforts to the state in which we despair of doing anything for ourselves and leave it to God. All right, so faith in the full sense requires attacking the greatest of sins, which is pride tied to self-conceit, some sense of our own goodness, our power, our competence. That needs to be completely destroyed. We need to be completely humiliated inside. Then and only then will we turn to God with the appropriate hope, reaction, and then God will then work through us, hopefully, and we can then be Christian in the full, faithful sense. Now, what happens then subsequently? Well, Christians have often disputed as to whether what leads the Christian home is the good actions or the faith in Christ. And sometimes there's a debate that says what you need to do is just really believe, and what your actions in the world are, that is insignificant or of lesser importance. Other people have argued the opposite, arguing that it's not so much a matter of what you believe, it's what you do. Act appropriately, fulfill your duties, and belief is a secondary matter. Now, what Lewis wants to do is integrate those two. The Bible really seems to clinch the matter when it puts the two things together into one amazing sentence. The first half is, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. And that is to emphasize not the faith side of the equation, but rather the action side of the equation. But the second half goes on, same phrase, for it is God who worketh in you. Right? And that is the thing that requires the faith. Right? So it is the actions, but the actions guided by the faith. I'm afraid that is the sort of thing that we come up against in Christianity. Now, he doesn't say that that totally solves the problem. Do we emphasize one more than the other? Does one come first and then the other comes second? I'm afraid that is the sort of thing that we come up. I am puzzled, but I'm not surprised. This is complicated, and even if we could work it out, I don't think, as he puts it here, I do not think human language could properly express it. But you will find that even those who insist most strongly on the importance of good actions will tell you that you need faith, and even those who insist most strongly on faith will tell you to do good actions. Both are important. How it all fits together in an ultimate satisfactory metaphysical answer, Lewis stops. At any rate, that is as far as I go.